And welcome to the very first episode of The Rent Roll. I'm your host, Jay Parsons. On this podcast, we're going to talk about all things rental housing. We'll talk multifamily apartments. We're going to talk single-family rentals. We'll talk build to rent. We're going to cover operational topics, investment topics, and capital markets. We'll talk about development. And of course, talk about those fun policy issues as well. I know what you're probably thinking, hey, there's a lot of podcasts out there. Do we really need another one? And to be honest, I kind of feel the same way. So we're going to try to do things a little bit different. There's a lot of great podcasts featuring long form interviews with some really good folks. And I don't think I could compete with that. I've said I want to do something a little bit different, hopefully mix things up a little bit. We're going to make this a program we hear about some different topics within the same podcast. So each week I'm going to try to highlight something that's topical of interest and through research and some trends that are either just being reported or things that I'm digging into. I'll dive into the headlines of the week, sharing you some things that are some key headlines on topics that impact both renters and investors and operators. And I'll give you my thoughts on those headlines. We'll cover comments and questions I get over social media, and that'll include the complaints in a segment that we're going to call the complaints department. Well, I get to address sometimes the more cynical or negative comments that we hear about over social media. I don't respond to all those online, but I do see most of them, and I thought it'd be fun to highlight some of those here on this podcast. And then, of course, we'll also do some fun rental housing trivia in each episode. So everybody loves good trivia. And we'll give you some nerdy rental housing trivia to take to the next bar night so you can really, really unimpress your friends with your rental housing knowledge. And then, of course, we will still do interviews. It's going to be a little shorter form. And with today's first episode, the key theme is around the investment case for middle income rental housing. And so I want to do that today by diving into an interview, a discussion with my good friend, Bob Simpson, the founder of the Multifamily Impact Council. And they'll be tying into the topic of today's discussion as well. So that'll be later on in the program. But let's dive in and let's get into this topic, the investment case for middle income rental housing. And then we're going to start off with some new research that just came out from the Pension Real Estate Association and Greg McKinnon specifically. He wrote this great article. The headline is, "Can Investors Afford to Ignore Affordability? The Investment Characteristics of Affordable Housing." And it's a really great paper. And I should first of all note that this isn't about affordable housing with a capital A, meaning subsidized low-income housing. It's really about a broader definition of housing affordability. And this is something that Bob's going to talk about later on in our interview as well. So the way that Greg's defining it here is rental housing that's affordable to people making about 80% of the area median income. And so what he did is he broke this down into three different groups. The most affordable being those at 80% below level, the mid-market, and the least affordable be your most expensive kind of Class A plus apartments. And he did this analysis using NCREIF data, which is kind of investment grade institutional quality multifamily. And so it's definitely skewed more on the institutional side. And what you see here is that the average return per quarter was higher for this most affordable group at 1.64%. The volatility was lower. I mean, volatility in multifamily rental housing in general is quite low, but it's even lower in this more affordable category. And the compound average annual return from 2008 to 2024 was also a good bit higher, about a percentage point higher than the middle market and a couple of percentage points higher than what they call least affordable or the top end of the market. And I should note here that, Greg points out that the higher end Class A product could still do really well. In fact, for shorter investment periods, this segment of the market can actually do very well. And that's either by kind of timing the market through luck or by skill, that segment can do very well. But over a long period of time, for longer term holders, there's a correlation between a lower price and a better performance. So ultimately, the punchline here is that you're not sacrificing on returns in order to invest in more affordable housing. In fact, you get a better return with lesser volatility over the long haul. So let me read a couple of quotes from Greg's article. He said, "Lower priced apartments produced higher average growth in the long term, along with higher average returns to investors." He also said NOI, or net operating income per unit, for the most affordable properties is much less volatile over time and tends to rise at a slow, steady pace. And also he said that over the 26-year time period, the most affordable properties outperform the least affordable by 239 basis points per year. And that is, I would say, pretty significant. So again, all of these and all the income levels actually did pretty well in the long haul, but the most consistent outperformance came at the lower end of the market. Now, one caveat I'll put in here is Greg told me later that the average building age in these more affordable properties in the NCREIF database is pretty similar to the top end. And so it's not that older properties are performing better. It's really more about the rent level. Specifically, it's about 16 to 18 years old. And so that's not really that old. And so what it tells us is that really the sweet spot is investment grade, well-maintained, lower priced apartments that tend to outperform because number one, you don't have the deferred maintenance issues, because if you do, it's either costs a lot of money to maintain those older properties, that can impact your NOI, or if you have a lot of deferred maintenance, that impacts the desirability of your property, which impacts your occupancy and your rents, which then also negatively impacts your NOI. So those are all things to be thoughtful of. Really, again, the sweet spot is newer vintage or newish vintage, where you don't have the same maintenance concerns, but you still have a desirable product at a competitive rent level. Now, this only adds to the increasingly clear investment case for particularly middle income housing. I want to share another one that was recently written by Mark Roberts and Jake Wegman, Mark at SMU, Jake at University of Texas. And this paper is called Moderate Income Rental Housing. And you look at this chart they produced, it shows you that orange dot is moderate income rental housing or middle income housing. And what it shows you is that it's lesser volatility than pretty much all other major investment types, including NASDAQ and the S&P, but also compared to other commercial real estate categories, but also had a better total return compared to most real estate other than industrial. But did outperform a lot of other categories, and so that, and including some bonds as well. So good stats there that kind of further the evidence that it's investing in affordable or middle income housing is not just a charity case. It's actually a win-win, both for investors and for renters. And I actually argue a win-win-win, renters, investors, and communities as well. Let me read a couple quotes from this paper. It said, moderate income rental housing compares favorably in terms of its return and has a lower variation in total returns from year to year since 2011 as compared to other common asset classes. And it also said that middle income rental housing since 2011 has exhibited relatively low correlation with indices, other mainstream asset classes, including stocks, government bonds, and high yield bonds. And so, very interesting to see there. Now, one of the things that I'm really passionate about, and I neglected to mention this earlier, but this is a podcast being sponsored by Madera Residential, where I'm spending quite a bit of my time now. And one of the things that I'm particularly passionate about, and I know our Madera team is passionate about, is this middle income category is really underserved as it relates to newer construction. Now, this chart here will show you just in Texas alone. You look at, we broke this into three buckets. Those are making less than $50,000 a year, $50,000 to $99,000 a year, and then greater than $100,000 a year. Now, you think about new construction, it typically caters to the lower end or the high end. The low end, of course, is your low-income housing tax credit. These are deals that are income restricted for the most part, where there's a tax benefit for the developer. And the top end of the market, most of your brand new, quote unquote, luxury market rate apartments are catering to six-figure income renters. And oftentimes that could be couple of roommates. So you could have two, for example, 26-year-old roommates making $55,000, $60,000 each, who together can afford these brand new apartments. But in the middle, we have, and just in Texas alone, nearly 3.5 million households who don't qualify for new housing, either because they make too much money to qualify for low-income housing, or they don't make enough to qualify for new market rate housing. So thankfully, we still do have housing for them. We have older properties sort of age into middle income and lower income rentals. It's our NOAA, or naturally occurring affordable housing. But there's a lack of product in that area because units either age into obsolescence or they have to get upgraded to some degree to take care of deferred maintenance issues. And so they can move the price up there. And so there's always a need for better quality middle income product. And that's where I think, there's really a strong investment case here. When you have good quality product for this middle income that's targeting kind of your workforce, middle income workers like teachers and nurses and firefighters and on down the line, your civil servants, like that is important for the kind of fabric of these communities. And so I think that's particularly important. Now the cynics out there will say, hey, the developers just need to build cheaper. That would solve all the problems. But just quickly, I want to show you a chart here. This shows you top reasons for apartment construction delays. Number one reason is project is not economically feasible at this time. And that basically means that we can't generate the rents necessary to justify the costs of this project, just not penciling out. It's not profitable to build. And so that's even at the top end of the market, building, kind of your class A plus higher end apartments even for those six-figure income renters. And so it's obviously much harder to build at those moderate income levels as well. And so certainly it does happen sometimes, but it's certainly not happening at real scale. And so that's a real challenge that needs to be addressed. But today, the high cost of debt, relative stickiness of construction costs, and flat to falling rents make it very hard for project to pencil out. And that's why apartment starts have plummeted as much as they have this year. And we'll get more into that in a moment. All right, our next segment is going to be trivia. I teased this earlier, rental housing trivia. Each time I'm going to give you a different question, something to chew on, have a little fun with, I hope. Today's question is, of the top 100 markets tracked by John Burns Research and Consulting, only 5 have average monthly rents below $1,300 a month for mid-tier single-family rentals. So we're jumping into the SFR world now. How many of those 5 can you name? And I'm going to give you a very big hint. All 5 are located in the Midwest region of the country. So chew on that. We'll answer that here in a little bit. Our next segment is in the news. All right, so we're gonna go through some headlines. I got 5 headlines we give some quick takes on. First thing, Wall Street Journal, apartment construction is slowing and investors are betting on higher rents. The rise in interest rates push construction loan costs up and property values down. And that's a pretty good headline and sub-headline, kind of gives away the key message there. And really, this is the kind of common investment case we see for apartments today, which is that today apartment construction is at 50-year highs, but starts are plummeting. In fact, the gap between starts and completions is at the highest level since the mid-1970s. And so we're completing a lot more projects than we're starting. And that points to significantly fewer projects completing in second half 25 and then 26 and 2027. That's just because of the factors I mentioned earlier. Everything's much more expensive and the rents are flat to falling, which makes it harder for these projects to pencil out. In many cases, the project may be worth less than its cost to build, which obviously is challenging math. So a lot of investors will look more at acquisitions than at construction. And so we've seen this thesis across investors who are buying today. We've seen investors who are saying, hey, we're willing to accept maybe year 1 and year 2 of relative challenges because we believe in the mid and longer term story for multifamily. Maybe the most prominent example was KKR and their big bet with an acquisition out of Lennar's multifamily portfolio called Quatera. Now, on a related note, let's look at our second headline. This is from the Dallas Morning News. Prosper bans new garden-style apartments complexes and limits them to specific areas. Under the approved changes to Prosper zoning laws, the first floor of a new multifamily structure must be able to support retail use. Now, this is a big deal because here we have construction is already dropping off, and now we have this suburb of Dallas, about 30 miles north of Dallas. This is, for those of you who know the DFW area, Prosper is just north of Frisco. It's the next suburb north. And so still a lot of green space up there, literally and figuratively. And what they're doing is basically making it even harder to build than it already is today, because garden style apartments, which are, we have multiple buildings with shared parking lots. These are low rises. And those are the cheapest apartments to build, which then also mean typically lower rents. But Prosper is not only saying, hey, no more garden style apartments, which means now you have to build wrap buildings, structured parking, apartment high rises. These are more expensive to build, which then means higher rents. And so I think this is some case where maybe the law of good intentions is going to backfire a little bit. Prosper as it grows, you want to have a workforce for there's housing for your teachers and your firefighters and others and your retail workers, hospitality to service that area. But it's going to be tough to be able for them to live in the town of Prosper if you don't have lower rent apartments. This is pretty much guaranteed that what gets built there is going to be very top of the market and effectively is a very strong kind of NIMBY, not in my backyard policy to restrict apartments. And I think that's ultimately going to be a challenge for those who want to work there, and that's going to have probably some impact on the market. Prosper also follows Frisco, which did something similar in terms of limiting garden-style apartments. But the added kind of unusual aspect here is Prosper is adding the requirement of ground floor retail, which in a further out suburb, there's only certain sites that are really going to cater to supporting ground floor retail. So it's going to get very tough to build and Prosper, and we'll see how that one plays out. Our next headline, also related to the same topics here. The New York Times, Dr. Ed Glazer, a well-known economist at Harvard, he wrote an op-ed, "This is how to fix the housing crisis." And what he notes in this is that, hey, we have a housing deficit in America. It's getting harder to build now. For us to really solve it, we have to build a lot more. The biggest roadblocks are towns like Prosper, but also more importantly, these big cities on the coast where it's been most problematic that have made it very difficult and very expensive to build housing. And so what he's proposed, something that's pretty radical, where basically you tie federal incentives to housing construction or knocking down zoning barriers to allowing more housing construction. So, and he claims this, or he makes the case that this is a federal issue, even though most real estate decisions are local. He says residents have made it particularly difficult to build in the most productive parts of America, which means that America's GDP is much lower than it would be if people could move to where jobs pay the most. Areas of the most upward mobility limit building the most, which makes America permanently unequal. And so then he says, hey, we should target problematic offenders with high housing costs and low construction. He writes, states with high price, low construction counties would have to figure out how to overrule local zoning codes themselves or lose federal transportation funding. So he's making the case specifically to tie it to transportation funding. So very interesting op-ed if you're not read it. You may not agree with all of it, but it does make a good case for how difficult this is. And some of the proposals from our presidential candidates really don't address the heart of the issue. All right, next topic. This one's a little more wonky, but it's also a very important topic. This is a letter that was written by some key industry trade groups to HUD, to U.S. HUD. And what they were writing about is in support of direct aid to renters in place of housing vouchers. And so specifically, they're talking about an electronic benefit transfer program that would give, instead of giving a voucher that goes through the public housing authority or public housing agency, it would go directly to the renter who could then pay the rent. And so these various industry groups, including National Multifamily Housing Council, National Apartment Association, Manufactured Housing Institute, Council of Affordable and Rural Housing, these various groups have come together and said, hey, we think this is more efficient, it's more effective, it deals with some of the problems that we have working with the public housing agencies, and ultimately would better serve renters as well. So not everybody's gonna agree with that one, but I do think that's a really interesting idea, and that's gonna hopefully be piloted by HUD, and we can see how that goes on a smaller scale. And our last headline, this is from Bloomberg, how rent controls are deepening the Dutch housing crisis. A law designed to make homes more affordable ended up aggravating an apartment shortage. And so this is really interesting. The Netherlands already had rent control, and what they did is they expanded it to a greater number of properties. And what they found is that it's actually exacerbated the problem, because now property owners are unable to make a profit on the rental. And so they're selling those homes to home buyers. And at first, you'll think, hey, it's a great thing. Now we have more homes to be able to buy, but that's not. They kind of forget about the other side of this, though, which that means there's fewer rentals now available. There's not like there's this one-to-one trade-off moving a property from the rental market to the for-sale housing market. There's now less available, and that's making it harder for people to find a place to live. And the few rentals that are not rent controlled, the pricing for those has been driven up even further. And it's created a real challenge. So there's a quote in the article that says, the sad reality is that for home seekers, it's now become harder than ever to find a rental property in an already tight market. And they talked about one property owner that's planning to sell 20% of its 13,500 rentals. And it also says in the article, while people at the lowest income levels will benefit from tight rent caps, those that are a bit higher on the economic ladder, your middle income, are being squeezed into a dramatically smaller private market. In a year, it's a quote, in a year, probably people will take to the streets to complain about the situation because it's getting harder and harder to find a rental property. The price will increase in the liberalized market because the demand is so high. So in other words, the law of unintended consequences remains undefeated. Everybody keeps trying to come back to the well of rent controls just to find it just backfires on the very people it's intended to protect. And so this is something to think about in America too, is there's been numerous proposals to incentivize single-family rental owners to sell properties to first-time home buyers. Ultimately that's just going to backfire. I mean, it could be a good thing for first-time home buyers, but it's going to backfire on single-family renters. Not every single-family renter is a would-be home buyer. And so if we take away supply, there's going to be an impact. And I think in our country, we need to focus more not just on a robbing Peter to pay Paul scenario, but on a win-win. How can we help the first-time home buyers without taking away from single-family renters. So more win-wins, more both ands, less either-ors. And I think we'll ultimately be at a better solution. And that ties us into our good question. So this is where I take a question from social media that I get and try to address that here. And so on that topic earlier, I want to take one I got on. The question was also about rent control. It asks, is there any historical evidence that rent controls have worked? And, I want to give a kind of a different answer to this, which is that there is one form of rent control that does work. And that's when you have not just the stick of rent control, but a carrot or an incentive as well. And so you see a program I mentioned earlier, like the low-income housing tax credit, where the developer is incentivized to build at rents that are guaranteed to be at certain levels of the area median income. That has worked because the funding is there for it, right? Either through a tax benefit or through reduced property taxes, reduce the costs, which then make the lower rent more palatable. So I think sometimes on the topic of housing, we get so focused on any win has to take away from something else or has to create a loser. But really the best examples of where we see really kind of lasting gains in affordability and affordable housing come when there's a win-win approach. And so thankfully we have seen proposals, including from the current White House, to increase funding for LIHTC. It's just not gone through, but I do think that's a good example of a win-win. Or it's not just limited to low-income affordable housing, by the way, but that is when you create an incentive for it, that will help ultimately build more affordable housing. Next segment, the complaints department. All right, I teased this one earlier. In addition to the good questions, I do get that occasional cynical comment in there as well. I said I don't always respond to them on social media. Most of the time they come from anonymous accounts, so I don't like to engage them too much. But sometimes a complaint comes up that really touches on a common misconception about rental housing. And so I do like to address those things in a productive manner. So recently I posted this chart. It says institutionally favored markets lag on single family rent growth. And what it shows you is that the markets with higher, this is just for the last year, and it shows you the markets that with higher concentration of institutional single family rental investors had lower rent growth. And so I got this cynical comment here. It says, this is cherry-picked data to prove the narrative. Expand the rental numbers over a longer time frame in those markets. Data is massaged by using year-over-year rent numbers when the investors piled on in 2020 and 2021 and drove prices up. And in the short run, markets are cooling year-over-year, but they're up a lot pre-COVID. All right, so let's look at since pre-COVID. This is going back to 2020, same chart. And what it shows you now is that it's a little more evenly distributed. But what's really the big takeaway here is take Atlanta, for instance. Nearly 25% of the single family rental stock is owned by institutional groups. Jacksonville is about a little over 20. Other markets like Charlotte, Nashville, Raleigh, Dallas, Fort Worth, Houston, Denver, all above average share of institutional owners among single family rentals. But in all these cases, we've seen rents that have risen just about around the national average. They're not the leaders. And despite the fact that these are also the markets being the most in migration, the most population growth, the most job growth. So on paper, you'd expect those markets to see more rent growth. That hasn't happened. They're growing roughly in line with the national average, maybe a little bit more, but they're not the leaders. You see the places that have grown the most are, places that you see like Philadelphia, Modesto, Knoxville, Fayetteville, Bakersfield, Albuquerque, Pensacola. These are non-institutional markets. So what's really going on? Well, not surprisingly, it's really about supply and demand. And some of these hot growth markets where we've seen more institutional investors, we also see more supply, both in the form of apartments, but also the build to rent single family homes, and also more of these accidental landlords who maybe would have sold their houses, but decided to wait it out for a period of time, maybe wait out for a better selling environment, and have chosen to rent out their homes in the meantime. So we have more supply in these markets, and even single family for sale homes, by the way. I should mention that too. Like in Texas and the Southeast, they're building more single family homes. And so all of that contributes to the overall housing supply, which puts downward pressure on prices. And so this idea that institutionally, if we have more institutional owners in a market, it's going to drive up rents, there's really no evidence to support that. It's a kind of a popular conspiracy theory, but it just hasn't really played out. It's all about supply and demand at the end of the day. And ultimately too, for institutional investors, they're looking for scale. And so even though, take a market like, Modesto may get higher single family rent growth, you might not be able to get the scale that you can get in, say, Atlanta. And so it still made more sense to invest in Atlanta where you could have your operating costs lower even if you're getting lesser on rents. All right, now let's come back to our rental housing trivia question. Today's question again was, of the top 100 markets tracked by the John Burns Research and Consulting Group, only 5 have average monthly rents below $13 a month for mid-tier single-family rentals. How many can you name? All right, so let's see what you got. 5 are Akron, Ohio, which all you LeBron James fans will know very well, just south of Cleveland. $10.86 a month, the cheapest single-family rental market in the country. Also Springfield, Missouri, Wichita, Kansas, Detroit, Michigan, and Cleveland, Ohio, all below $1,300 per month. All right, and now we enter the interview portion of today's podcast, a conversation with my friend Bob Simpson from the Multifamily Impact Council. Now, if you don't know Bob, and I hope you already do, Bob worked for the Senate Majority Leader Tom Daschle in the Senate. He spent 20 years at Fannie Mae, and now he's heading up the Multifamily Impact Council. So, Bob, thank you so much for being here. And first thing, I love that you put, both in your consulting business and in this industry who started the word impact. Not just affordable housing or affordability, but the word impact. So tell me just a little bit why that word and what drives your passion for this.
Yeah, I think for me, look, I'm not I didn't go to college for real estate. I was never really. I think real estate and housing is a really fascinating topic. It's never really been the thing that got me up in the morning. Mm-hmm. I think housing is just a tremendous vehicle to improve a person's life. That's part of my lived experience. It's part of what I've seen. And so, I think that, if you think about it, you will spend more time in your home than any other building on the face of the earth.
Yeah.
And so, you spend more money where you live. You will spend more time sleeping. That's where you go when you're sick. You'll waste more energy there. All that stuff. And so for me, I've always been driven by the idea that you should be able to figure out it. I've always wanted to work in a career where I could help people, but also do well for myself at the same time. And I can't think of a better place than multifamily housing, because you can do something at a property and it can have a positive or negative impact on 100 people who live there. So why not? It's a no-brainer. So for me, it's always been about the impact. It's never been about the real estate. It's just the real estate's a way to get there.
Oh, I love that. Yeah, that's well said. It reminds me, obviously we've seen through the COVID era, you can work from home, you can shop from home, but you can order food from home, but you got to have a home. So yeah. I love that mission. So, Bob, one thing that you and I share a passion for is around affordability, and particularly, one thing I've spent a lot of time talking about lately and presentations and writings I've done is that, affordability is a bifurcated issue where, we've seen enormous demand from upper income renters who can afford today's market rates. And, we have 1 million more occupied market rate apartment units than we did prior to COVID. And these are generally folks who are paying, low 20% of income toward rent. They're paying the rent on time. But at the same time, I always tell people there's two things that are true. We have this, but at the same time, there is a real affordability challenge. We have millions of households who cannot afford the rent. We have a shortage of affordable housing. So I want to dive into that part a little bit. And when we talk about affordable housing, you put out a great piece recently talking about definition. So talk to me about how you define affordable housing. How do you think about that? It's such a broad concept.
Yeah, I think it can get as complicated as you want it to get. And we can have a lot of conversations around how to define affordable housing, but I've never found any of those conversations have ever built a unit, right? So, sure, the current definition we have isn't perfect, right? It basically says that you shouldn't pay more than 30% of your income for rent. And if you do, then the housing you're living in isn't affordable. And we can have conversations whether it's 30% or 35% or 25%. What matters to me, and the way I always think about it as affordability, is do you have enough money left over after paying rent to go to the grocery store and get what you need? And if you don't, then that's a problem, right? And so I think that's the way I always look at it is 30% is a great place. It's standard. It's what everyone uses. It is not perfect, but it does allow us to move the ball forward. And I think that we should have conversations around what constitutes affordability in different markets. Clearly, there are unique situations all across the country in terms of what's affordable and what's not. We should leave that up to the state and local governments to make that decision and not let it get in the way of the fact that, yeah, this isn't perfect, but we should still get stuff done. And at the end of the day, it's really not what you pay for rent, it's what you have left over after the rent is paid, because that's what's going to dictate the future of your life and the future of your kids' lives.
Yeah, well said. And we've seen, lately, or at least the past few years, we've seen more proposals for expanding, particularly a low-income housing tax credit. Vice President Harris has proposed a similar expansion, as did the current White House. Is that part of the solution here?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, so I think a lot of the time the challenge is not to get stuck into this either or argument, right? Yeah. That we just need rental housing for low income households, or we just need more rental income for middle income households. We need both. It's a both and situation. And so I think, the work that the low income housing tax credit sector does is phenomenal, right? They're able to get really broad bipartisan support and help explain why this matters, because they're able to really communicate the shared incentive that investors have, that property owners have, and that renters have. And all three benefit. And that's the key. And so I think, the more that we can do to really, look at this as we need all of, I don't think anyone would disagree with the idea that mixed income housing is a really good thing and that we need more socioeconomic diversity in our multifamily properties. It's a really good thing. And that's where I think policy is headed. And so the more that we can do that, and the more that we can get federal funding to support this, the better. But at the same time, we also need to make sure that we are, looking at making sure that we're spending those funds wisely, and that we're, really thinking long and hard about, construction costs, and making sure that we're giving flexibility to state and local governments to make sure that that the housing that they are financing is relevant to the needs of the local population. And I think all those things can be done. I'm much more optimistic. I'm always optimistic. You can't not be an optimist if you're in the affordable housing world. But I'm more optimistic than I have been in the past. And I think the whole idea around, being able to work together, I think that's a really critical thing. And I think the other piece is, it's not just we can't just rely on the state and federal government. This is a public-private partnership that we need to forge. And I do think that there is an increasing level of interest, around the idea that we can increase the flow of private capital from across the world to come in and support affordable and sustainable housing in the United States for both low-income and middle-income households.
Yeah, I agree. I like how you talk about kind of these win-wins, and unfortunately, we live in a world where it seems like some folks feel they can't win unless somebody else loses, right? But this is a good example of win-win. These programs where ultimately it's a public-private partnership, like you said. A lot of people forget this was created by the Reagan administration as a way to incentivize the private sector to solve a problem in the shortage of affordable housing. So it's been a good partnership, and hopefully we can expand upon that. So Bob, related question then, we talked about affordable. Now we're seeing more conversation around attainable housing. Some people call it workforce housing, middle income housing. I know that the Multifamily Impact Council is spending some time around definitions here as well. And I want to get into the potential for a MyTech program also. But first and foremost, how do you think about attainable workforce, middle income housing?
I just call it affordable housing. I really do. It's middle income housing. Look, it either is affordable or it's not, and it doesn't matter what you make, right? Is it affordable to you? And so I think of it as just affordable housing. And if it's an affordable housing property that's affordable to low income households, that's great, and that's really good information to know, and we should do more of it. And if it's affordable housing to middle income households, that's also affordable housing. So I think of it as all as affordable housing. I think there's obviously a distinction around affordable housing that's not subsidized and affordable housing that is. And I think that's the distinction that's more important, as opposed to, getting into, if you use the word workforce, I lived in a low income housing tax credit and I worked. So that was workforce housing for me. Yeah. So I don't know. That just seems like a conversation that wastes people's time. So I just call it affordable housing.
It's well said.
It's affordable. And it's also attainable. I mean, attainable is you can have attainable housing for low income households too. But it's really just, is the unit affordable to the people who live there, right? Does it help them stay in place longer? Does it increase your occupancy? Does it help them build stability and improve their way of life so that they can become a part of the community, so that their kids can graduate from the same high school that they entered as a freshman? And when you do that, obviously that's 4 years of no vacancy related costs for that unit. That's just a good thing. And so I always go back to the idea that this is really not rocket science.
Yeah,
it's affordable housing. Right.
That's well said. And as we think about, you're right. It's affordable housing. To some degree, the definitions matter because it impacts what can get funded and built and subsidized. And so there's been a proposal for years now from, as you know, Senator Wyden out of Oregon for a middle income housing tax credit. It's not made much traction. But I look at it this way. It's like you have a segment of the population that could live in low income housing tax credit communities that could be new construction. You have a segment of the population that can afford brand new market rate construction. And you have the so-called missing middle that really can't afford anything new. And unfortunately, we do have the naturally occurring affordable housing. But this tends to be a shrinking segment of the market due to obsolescence and value add upgrades as properties get older and whatnot. I mean, you know all this very well. So what role, if any, do you see a MyTech program having? Do you think it's a viable one?
Yeah, I think it's a viable one. I think that, the financing is a little different, right? And so I think the subsidy level would be a little bit less. I think it's a viable program. I think it's something we should do. I think that, the other thing that we would need to do along with it is make sure that we have, that it's constructed in a way that will complement the low-income housing tax credit program, right? But also that it is able to reach the broadest number of investors. So, I think there's two ways you can do that. I mean, number one is people in the housing world should pay a lot of attention to the tax debate around the corporate tax rates, right? I think the best way to increase the number of investors in the low-income housing tax credit program or a middle-income tax program is to probably increase the corporate tax rate a little bit, right? Maybe not a significant amount, but I think lowering it is a significant downside impact on affordable housing. And I think the second thing is when you construct it, just make sure that it's built in the same way as the tax credit program. And also it would be a great opportunity to really revisit how we're able to maybe do some resyndication and make the tax credit more valuable to investors who may not have a 10-year time horizon, right? Yeah. And I think that would allow for more corporates to get involved beyond your typical investors, right? Utilities and right. Longer term investors, but being able to get some companies who are looking for a tax benefit for 5 years. Don't develop a 5-year program, but just allow for some resyndication.
Yeah, and I think the good news for investors too. You framed this up earlier, Bob, talking about how you can make an impact for communities and for renters, and also be beneficial to investors and to individuals. Is that we've seen more research, and I'm talking about this also in this podcast of examples where middle income housing and affordable housing has been impactful for investors as well. And so historically, it could sometimes be viewed as kind of like a charity investment, but it's not. A good paper just published by Greg McKinnon at PRIA on this topic, showing the kind of long-term outperformance of apartments that are affordable. Mark Roberts wrote a great paper a couple of years ago, SMU professor at Pro Holdings, on this topic as well. And so, my hope is we just see, more groups rallying around this, wanting to make an impact, but also in their communities, but being able to convince their investors they're not sacrificing something to do that.
Yeah, I mean, it's like the biggest, we should have like a Mythbusters episode and focus just on financial returns and credit performance, right? No, I thought the SMU paper was phenomenal, and Greg's paper was just spot on. I think it also highlights really the other thing that we really need to do as we're reaching out to private investors is not only to help folks understand why this is a good investment, why this helps you meet your fiduciary responsibility, but also make sure that we are being very clear about what type of investor this works for, right? This is a long-term investment. If you're a long-term investor who values stable cash flow and capital appreciation over time, and you want to make an impact, but more importantly, you just want stable cash flow and preserve your capital, this is it, right? This is a great investment. If you are a short-term investor and you want to make a 3-year investment and you want to get out after 3 years and see a significant amount of capital appreciation, do not invest in impact-driven, affordable multifamily housing. That's a value-add play, and there's room for that in the world, right? People do it. Good for them. It's not an impact investment, right? The value of affordable housing is that it is boring and it makes money over time, and that it is not speculative, and it relies on the person living there staying there for a long time and improving their income over time. And so the alignment doesn't happen at a 3-year window. It happens at a longer term window. And I think that's really important. And the second thing is to really also emphasize the fact that these deals exhibit stronger credit characteristics over time, right? So as part of the article that I put in, if you look at the Fannie Mae data since 2012, 12-month trailing serious delinquency rates of multifamily properties in their book of business, when you compare market rate versus affordable consistently has lower serious delinquency rates than the conventional book. And a lot of that's for the same reason that it drives stable NOI growth in Greg's paper, right? Higher occupancies, higher economic occupancies, lower costs, and also you have support from state and local federal subsidy sources that make sure that deal continues to survive. So it's just a tremendous investment, but it's a great investment for endowments, sovereign wealth, pension funds, insurance companies, anyone who really believes in stable NOI growth over time.
Yeah. So, Bob, let's talk about a related but different topic that's also, I know, near and dear to you, and that is construction lending. And just set the table a little bit for those watching. We're in a period right now where the market's benefiting from the highest supply volume in 50 years, putting downward pressure on rents at all levels. Even, you build Class A, there's a filtering impact. It's been well documented. It's not just industry stuff. Like there's been academic papers on this topic showing the downstream impact to even the Class C and affordable market. But starts are plummeting. And so as we look out to certainly by 26 and 27, there's going to be a lot less supply out there. And one of the challenges is just it's hard to get deals that pencil out. Sticky construction costs, high cost of debt, flat to falling rents for these lease ups. And so, Bob, it puts us in a situation where it kind of reminds us that construction is very cyclical. Yeah. And construction lending is cyclical as well. Now you have deals too where maybe the property is worth less than the cost to build it. And so there's been some calls to have a little more stability that might help in the construction lending to make supply also a little more steady. So one of those ideas centers around potentially enabling the GSEs, Fannie and Freddie, who historically have not been allowed to do construction lending, to get into some type of construction lending role. So I know you've put a lot of thought in this. So I'd love just to pick your brain a little bit. Do you think this model can work? And if so, how could it work?
Yeah, I think there's a model where it can work. I think there's models where it really won't work, right? I mean, number one is I don't think that the GSEs are built to do construction lending. That's what the banks do, and they do it really, really well. And it's also it's a short-term loan, And I would say that's, the best way to think about things that work is to first, pencil out the things that don't work. That doesn't work. I would not do that. The challenge in the new construction market isn't really around the availability of permanent takeout financing when a deal's stabilized. The GSEs do a phenomenal job at that, right?
Yeah.
It's not as much around the construction lending side, right? The construction lenders do a really good job of it. They handle the draws. They're able to assess risk. They know their local communities. They have a good handle on that. The challenge is really in the middle, right? So making a deal work can be really, really challenging. And I think that one of the things that I think that would really help stimulate the new construction market, and we've put out some work on this, and as have others, is around the idea of really supporting a pref equity fund, right? So if you think about a traditional deal as you get into this, right, typically you have 65% of the property is going to be funded with permanent debt, 40% is coming from equity, and then the construction loan is covering everything that gets you there, and then you get the takeout with the perm debt. Getting a deal to pencil with that in today's environment, or honestly in most environments for affordable housing, is ridiculously hard.
Okay.
So I think being able to really develop a pref equity fund that could provide that middle 20%. It can be short-term, 5-year pref equity that really helps leverage the equity, that 20%. It gets the deal done. But and this is where Fannie and Freddie come in really handy, is they don't have to do this. They can fund it, right? If they have the regulatory authority to do so, which I don't think they have yet, but
right.
Fingers crossed. They can fund it and work with their existing lenders who already do this. But if you're able to put that money out, that preferred equity out at a lower rate, that's still above market, right? That's still that still is good for the taxpayer, right? I think you can do a lot more, and you can also make the construction cost more affordable. It makes these deals pencil out. And it also allows you to be able to say, look, and we can also set parameters on this, right? I mean, if you're going to build, you should build affordable housing, and at least half the units should be affordable to middle income families, right? This is a public partnership. And the second is construction costs should be in line with, you shouldn't be building a unit that's per unit construction costs that are higher than Class A market rate deals. And I don't understand why that happens. That should not happen. And so I think you can do that. I think it will incentivize folks to innovate. I think we'll still have high quality housing. But I also think that it will help, really unstick what's really clogging up the construction market today. And it's really just that cost of capital in the middle. And it allows you, especially if you can attach it to a permanent takeout. Yeah. That's what really frees up construction financing. And it also helps de-risk the construction lenders, right? Because all of a sudden there's an additional source of equity behind it that they can count on.
No, it's a great point. And also, just to build upon that a little bit too, is we've seen construction lenders, like you said, they're still out there, but they're doing lower loan to cost ratios. So it's creating more of a gap for these developers have to raise capital. So a pref piece like that can be very helpful.
And look, and a lot of the construction lenders are small regional banks, right? Yeah. And so their capital constraints are a lot higher. And so you want to make sure that you are not putting the onus on them, but also that you can get to a takeout as soon as possible, and that takeout is secure.
Yeah, by the way, that reminds me, sometimes I wish that the federal regulators who are telling the regional banks to stop lending on multifamily and whatnot, or to be more careful, would coordinate with the other parts of the federal government saying that we need more housing. So sometimes they get a little disconnected there.
Yeah, or bunching everyone into commercial real estate.
Yes.
Or not making a distinction.
It's all office buildings. That's all it is, right?
Or I saw something the other day that was talking about rent-controlled buildings, and this is the SVB Bank and the New York stuff. And using this is why rent restricted buildings don't make sense. I was like, those are so different. They're just so different. I mean, this is like completely not it, right? We actually, if those properties were rent restricted, there probably would be less of an issue than if it was rent controlled. But
yes, well, that's another good conversation for another day. Well, Bob, before we leave, and y'all are doing some great work at the Multifamily Impact Council. I guess we didn't start with this, but can you tell us a little bit about it and kind of close it with any other projects you've not touched on that are near and dear to your heart right now?
Yeah, so just the 30 seconds, Multifamily Impact Council, we're a nonprofit membership organization, and we're singularly focused on helping to increase the flow of capital to support affordable and sustainable housing in the United States that delivers impact. We developed the first, and we maintain this, the first industry standard framework for impact investing in the multifamily sector. It's free, it's open source. Go to our website, download it. We're in the process of putting out version 2.0, which has some enhancements and some tweaks to the product. And we'll do this every year. And so look for that to come out soon. So that's number one, primarily what we do. We help set standards and help organizations develop their impact strategies so that they can hopefully attract more capital. And we work with investors so that they can really, get a good due diligence questionnaire that delivers on this impact and helps them understand how impact can also drive financial results. And then the second thing that we're working on that I'm really excited about is we have a great research project going on with NYU, their Center for Sustainable Business Practices, to really take their existing methodology to quantify the financial value of sustainability and marry it with the multifamily impact framework and start quantifying, how do these impact practices that support affordability and sustainability and climate, how do they drive financial value for your net operating income, for your credit performance, and really help quantify that connection between social impact and a person's fiduciary responsibility to their investors. So that'll be cool. Look for that next year, but we're just getting into it. It's really interesting.
Well, as a research nerd, I'm excited to see where that goes.
Yeah.
Well, Bob, thank you so much for the time. Really appreciate it. Thanks for letting me pick your brain a little bit.
Absolutely. Thanks, Jay. Anytime.
All right. That was a lot of fun talking to Bob. Hope you all enjoyed that as well. And Bob, thank you again for joining. That's going to wrap up our first edition of the Rent Roll podcast. Really appreciate everybody joining with us today. And a big thank you to our sponsor, Madera Residential. Check it out, maderaresidential.com. For those of you watching, if you had comments, complaints, questions, or just general thoughts about today's podcast, please let me know. Would love to know how to make this better. But I do appreciate spending part of your day with us, and I hope to see you next time. Thanks again.